Right, I would like to welcome you all for our fifth lecture series within the Planetary Health Academy on the subject of transdisciplinary perspectives. As guests we have Claudia Kemfert, Harald Lesch and Johannes Vogel, and we'll introduce them individually when the time comes. I would also like to remind you that the fourth, fifth and sixth lecture series about transformation, transdisciplinarity and communication are linked together. Last time we saw that Luisa Neubauer and also Maike Weisflug gave us examples of great communication, so there will be overlaps and we'll build on the essential points from last time. I would like to highlight two ideas. What Maike said, for example, that good life, working together, recognizing planetary boundaries is the key. Beyond the illusion of thinking that anything is possible, of unlimited freedom. So good life is related to understanding the boundaries and within these boundaries being able to create life in a creative way and stopping to think that everything is possible for everyone anytime. And the point by Luisa Neubauer, who was very impressive, talking about this key element or tipping element for her when she went to the Katowice climate conference and saw that all these delegations are not the ones who are going to implement climate protection. It is up to her or up to every one of us really who count, and we are political animals, we are climate activists who need to be creatively active in their local contexts and moving forward from there. And she was also quite, we should be also quite shocked at what we're facing and then creating hope for the future. So it's a big gap between being shocked about lethargy, because of the fact that we have missed the boat lots of time, and at the same time looking forward, looking to science, putting the jigsaw puzzle parts together, and on the other hand, be confident, be positive about the future, because resignation, frustration has not been productive ever. So we'd like to build on that. I'd also like to report about myself and many members of the network who are very worried about what has happened in the last 2 weeks. I think we're all in solidarity with people who are committed for the idea of Black Lives Matter. And in this context, I would also like to remind you, as we said, that in our work everything is about justice. The climate question is very much a justice issue, and as we've seen with the COVID crisis, but also the climate catastrophes, that the poorest part of the population, people who are African Americans, Latinos in America, but also in other countries, they are the hardest hit by the climate disaster, and the people who cause it are predominantly the richest 1% or 0.1%. The richer people are, the bigger their footprint, and therefore the bigger their responsibility to become committed and to contribute. And I think this has touched many of us, and we'll hear more about that in our discussion. And now I would like to pass the floor to Sylvia, who is going to introduce Ms. Kemfert. Thank you very much, Martin. Right, I'm pleased to welcome Ms. Kemfert with us. You are the leading German energy expert, and it's very fitting today to also discuss transdisciplinarity. In the past, we've looked a lot at health, and the last time we have started thinking about transdisciplinarity. I would like to say a few words about yourself, and then, of course, you'll pick up. You head the Department for Energy, Transport and Environment at the German Institute for Economic Research. You are also a member of the board of the Club of Rome. Some of you may know this. This is an institution which for many decades has been working for sustainability, and you are a professor at the Hershey School of Governance, and you also published a book which I'd like to mention here because the title fits our whole series very well. The title is Mondays for Future, and I think the subtitle is even better. Going out to demonstrate on Fridays, discussing on the weekend, and doing things, getting your hands dirty on a Monday. So, with this, I would like to pass the floor to you. Thank you, Martin Herrmann and Sylvia Hartmann. I'm very pleased to be with you today and to share a few of my thoughts. I was pleased to hear that this lecture series has dealt with a lot of subjects. I think they are highly interesting, and I'm pleased to see that today we are discussing climate protection, planetary boundaries, effects on health and energy transition, and I'm very pleased that this goes together with Harald Lesch and Mr. Vogel, who I know both of them, and so hello to the two great colleagues. So I would like to show you a few slides which I have prepared, and hopefully you can see these slides now. So the question for today was planetary health from knowledge to transformative action. This is precisely the subject which is of concern to us as well, and I'd like to make 4 points for the discussion. As we can see very similar patterns between COVID-19 and also the climate crisis. At least the patterns seem to be very similar, and I would wish to see a similar effect which we have seen for the corona crisis, and hopefully this can be translated to the time once we have left the corona crisis, at least to some extent, and achieved more normality. 4 points are important to me. The first thing is science has been warning about pandemics for a long time, and the same is true for the climate situation, but it's interesting to see that there have been warnings about these effects, and they actually happened now. And the same with COVID-19 as for climate. The second point, far-sightedness pays off, both in the preparation for pandemics. There have been various scenarios of preparation, so test capacities have been provided or should be extended. You have prepared communication, and then once you've got those preparations, you can call on those preparations if needed, and the same for the climate. So we can have a long-term view as to the future developments, and it pays to look into the future and to consider the future even now. So for climate protection, this would mean reducing emissions or adaptation to climate change. And the third point, the crisis motto is interesting. It has been communicated very widely, called flatten the curve. This is something which has become part of our language now. Without being virologists, we understand what flatten the curve means, what R values and K values are, and the same for climate protection when it comes to explaining how climate change develops and why it's important to keep the curve flat, and why is it necessary to take every action possible to make sure the curve does not rise steeply. And the fourth point is important to me. We have a very essential component. We need to use our strong democracy because of solidarity, which you can find in the corona crisis, is a kind of generational contract. So the first measures which were enacted, it was about the young people, strengthen the old people because of social distancing, which is terrible but works. Everyone understands in society how it works and acts accordingly, and in the same way, it's important to also consider this generational contract when it comes to the climate, the causes of climate change. The people who cause climate change need to be responsible and do everything they can not to further damage climate. And in this way, they would make it possible for future generations to have a an environment worth living in. These are the 4 points I would like to mention, and we will hear more from Harald Lesch about this, for example, when it comes to climate change, why this is so important, and to have reasons to be worried. To know about these reasons, and we can see a global warming process which is far advanced now. If you look at the current developments of global temperatures, like here, we have advanced quite far, and the issue now is that we need to prevent this very steep rise in temperatures, which is threatened. If we allow the emissions to continue, then we'll have a world with 3, 4 or 5 degrees increase of the surface temperature globally, as you can see on the right-hand side. These are possible scenarios, and the names are the climate models which are used as part of the IPCC, and you can see a certain bandwidth there. But so these are the scenarios. Either we'll achieve a flattening of the curve, then the global surface temperature will not rise as strongly, or on the other hand, emissions rise more strongly, and then we'll have a world of 4 or 5 degrees global warming, which would be a huge reason for concern. We can see now there is a global warming. The summers get hotter and drier. I live in Berlin, and last year even we had massive droughts, water shortages in April. It's hard to believe. And everyone, even in our latitudes, can perceive the fact that we are living in a world of rising temperatures, and it's also the case that in many countries which are not causes, are not the ones to cause the climate change, are the ones to suffer most, and this global heating or warming produces extreme weather events, especially in these regions of the world. I would like to highlight the various sectors involved there. Economically speaking, we have, for example, sectors such as tourism, agriculture, but also health, which is in the foreground today. And there could be whole regions uninhabitable, then there's no need to talk about tourism. It's also about the fact that agricultural food generation will be compromised, that extreme climate events also cause changes in the energy supply we have. No matter what type of energy supply, just think of conventional power plants such as coal or nuclear plants, which need a lot of cooling water in order to reliably produce energy, and at times of extreme droughts and water shortages, there's no water left for that. And what we have seen in Europe in summertime several years in a row now, and so there is a risk that the energy supply could be interrupted, and so we have an energy sector which can also be damaged seriously, but also all the other sectors can suffer from extreme climate events. There will be damage to buildings, to infrastructure. Insurance companies have to compensate, or they will not compensate for this damage. And so this is something we're going to see more of if climate change is not decelerated, not slowed down. And we shouldn't forget that we have different economic challenges, be it for agriculture, meaning that the food production is compromised or is reduced, or, for example, forestry. There is a very serious forest fire risk, wildfire risk, or also water could be compromised. And one point which is in the foreground here up on this list is health. And we must say that there are huge health effects, especially through heat waves, extreme temperatures, which need to be protected from through architecture, through urban development, in order to make these heat waves more tolerable. Or extreme damage could occur because of floods or storms, and this could also have a health effect, or diseases which could rise which could be caused by this global change in climate. The second point, which is important to me, is that we should be prepared, get prepared for a world with limited climate change, if possible, but also a world we need to gear up for. Farsightedness is paying off. If we want to avoid climate effects, then the global surface temperature must be limited, and this means the emissions must not rise too much. And we know that nearly all the greenhouse gases are generated because of the burning of fossil fuels, which makes a huge contribution to global climate change. And for this reason, we can break them down. What is the need for a reduction of emissions? It's 80 to 95% reduction of greenhouse gases in order to achieve the 1.5 degrees goal or the 2 degrees goal, which also means that the bulk of fossil resources must stay in the ground. This is true for oil, gas or coal, and it means that these reserves which are digging out of the ground must not be taken out of the ground anymore. We are seeing a fossil fuel sellout. The fossil fuel industry is in the doldrums, which we could see in the financial markets, and we must make sure that we must not burn more coal, otherwise these climate goals will be missed. In Germany, we have agreed on sector-by-sector objectives, for example, transport or energy or industry, which need to contribute to a reduction of these emissions. And it's good for us to break this down to the sectors so that we have responsibilities, so that we have a transport ministry which will react to this and do everything they can to reduce road emissions, or in the industrial processes, they must become more climate neutral increasingly, but also agriculture needs to react. And this is so important that we should realize that every component is important. You can see by 2050 we need to reduce emissions to 80 to 95%. And the third point is flatten the curve. I think it's something which we hear every day, this phrase, and this is also an interesting parallel between COVID-19 and climate change. For climate change too, we need a very flat curve. The global surface temperature should not rise, because they will touch upon tipping points if the emissions rise more. This could cause irreversible climate changes, which we must avoid. So as the flatter the curve, the higher the chances that extreme weather events or climate events will not occur, and that we can achieve the 2 degrees goal. But the steeper the curve at the beginning, and the faster the emissions have to be reduced. This would mean that we have disruptive change, which is inefficient, expensive, and a drain on the global economy. So the flatter we keep the curve, the more we're able to prolong this process. As with the corona pandemic, they will have more time to react and not having to gear to these shocks too much. And the same with the climate. The flatter the curve, the more time we'll have, and the better you can implement these changes, and the chances related to that can be used much better. And this is really the purpose of our exercise, to make sure, if possible, to really stretch the time until we've completely exhausted our greenhouse gas budget. So the faster we can act now, the better this is for the economy, the more efficient it is, and there will be less disruptive change. The fact that the emissions can be reduced is obvious. There are not too many ways about this. All we know is that the fossil fuel emissions must stop. We must not continue burning fossil fuels, and the replacement is renewable energies, energy-saving, climate-neutral economy. But you can also see emissions need to drop very steeply. Now I'd like to make a brief excursion to health protection, because this is also the intention of today's event. And as part of the Council on Environmental Questions, we have looked at this question very closely. The fact that sustainable development, climate protection also always means health protection, and that we have to look at these sustainability goals very closely. And the third goal, number 3, here is very decisive. It's about having good health and well-being, which can be achieved through that. And we can clearly say that climate protection is also basically the same as good as health protection, because the fewer extreme climate events we have, the better this will have. The better effect will be on health. And the other aspect is no hunger. This is SDG number 2, Sustainable Development Goal number 2, or number 8, where it comes to social justice, that we also need to make sure that there is humane work. This is also very relevant today. What does it mean, humane work? How can social justice be achieved? And what does good work mean? How can we integrate it? And SDG 11, which is also very important, where we've looked at this very closely, is sustainable cities and communities. I will come back to that very briefly. And goal number 13 is my first topic. So one sustainability goal is climate protection. So if you look at this component of health, so how can we achieve, regarding health as a kind of bracket subject into our political decisions and also economic decisions, we can see that health affects both the sector of living, residence, but also energy and transport. All these aspects have an impact on health. For example, when it comes to living, if we think about the rising temperatures, especially in conurbations, and the issue there is to have sufficient green spaces, parks, which are crucial, but also buildings which are able to balance the heat budget and be heat absorptive, and ensuring a comfortable climate inside these buildings. The same with energy supply. We need to make sure the energy supply is as non-polluting as possible. Mercury from coal-fired power plants is just as bad as other particles, for example, which are generated through fossil fuels, by contrast with renewable fuels, at least in most cases, when you don't want emissions, and certainly not polluting emissions. And then the aspect of transport, here it's important to have active mobility in cities, bicycle transport, walking on foot, and is also very relevant for health, of course. And we need to make sure that we have a good transport system, which always also means it's good for health. And as part of the expert council, we have looked some examples here. For example, the fact that health can be a cross-sectional topic for urban development, on the example of the city of Leipzig, where you see that the individual elements, living, community, education, social participation, culture, sports, good work, they work together, and the aspect of health is a cross-sectional topic. So the well-being of a society when it comes to inclusion, equal opportunities, digital cities, architectural development. So health is a cross-sectional topic. So whatever we're doing, what we're discussing here, also when it comes to planetary boundaries, always concerns health in all its components, from all its directions. Therefore, it is necessary to recognize that health protection and well-being always goes hand in hand with the environment and with climate goals, with urban development and strategies which are directed at humane cities. and this always will also develop or be in favor of health protection. My last point, fourth point, which is also important to me, and we're learning this now from the pandemic. How can we strengthen ourselves based on this crisis? We need to recognize that a strong democracy, strong solidarity will carry us through these crises and give us strength for future crises. So we'll be able to handle future crises better, which brings me to my favorite subject, energy transition with renewable energies and decentralized energy supply, which improves participation, democracy, well-being. And it will also strengthen the resilience of an economic system. What is meant by that? Well, if you use renewable energies, decentralized energies, then you are less vulnerable to certain shocks which could occur, for example, through fossil fuel wars, which are going on outside in the world out there, or the economic set-downs because of the pandemic. And the more decentral we can supply our energy, what you can do locally, this will improve resilience of your community. And it doesn't mean to say that we should become autonomous or self-sufficient and regard ourselves as an island, but we should think about improving participation through this energy supply system. And why is it interesting in Germany? We have already started our energy transition 20 years ago with a targeted promotion of or support for renewable energies, and they are in the hands of the citizens. It's a grassroots movement because people invest in solar plants or they participate in wind energy plants or other parts of renewables, and they are part of the solution, and this is also creates a sense of identity, improves the acceptance level, and through this you don't have just a good effect on the environment, but also a good effect on social justice. So the energy transition is a great project to strengthen everything at the same time. So from our point of view, it's important to have a positive take on this. We can control climate change, we can make it by really pulling all the levers quickly now, moving towards 100% renewable energies, not just for our energy supply, also for the transport sector and for housing energy. And we've got lots of studies which we've supported, and I've supported that this is technically feasible, that it's economically and technically efficient. So this world based on renewable energies is not rocket science. It is something which is technically manageable reasonably easily, and it's based on known technologies which exist now. And the solar energy, for example, can be used globally. You don't have to be connected to the grid even, and this will also give you more chances of participating and becoming more resilient. And this is something I always bang the drum for when it comes to spotting the crisis. What are the roads to the future? It can be economically rewarding to strengthen renewable energies. We can produce lots of fruits, not just in terms of the negative environmental effects which we avoid. We can strengthen the economy, we can strengthen our health, and we can really favor the future technologies. And in the current day and age, it's important to become independent of some shocks which may occur across the globe. And this is my point for today, that we should not take a step back and allow ourselves to suffer a setback. We should be stronger through the crisis. We should work for climate protection even more. We should use the subsidies, especially for climate protection, environmental protection, health protection, by expanding renewable energies in all kinds of sectors, having green urban mobility, favoring bicycles, favoring foot transport, less pollution, and so on. And when it comes to delivery, transport, doing this through e-mobility, so to achieve a silent and clean way of transport. So don't waste the crisis. Once we are going to spend subsidies now, let's spend it for climate protection purposes. And there are technical challenges, but these are future technologies, and it's economically sound to invest them then, and there is an investment backlog anyway. And if we invest in these future technologies, we'll make progress not just in the field of digitalization, also we create artificial options for artificial intelligence and create great opportunities. Everyone's talking about hydrogen today. That's a technology which has been around for decades. It's a part of the solution. It's not the panacea. Some people are dreaming of it, but it can be part of a solution towards a world with 100% renewable energies. But of course, hydrogen has to be produced. It is very costly. You need green power for that, so it should be only used where no other option exists. But we are talking about an orchestra with different instruments and different solutions and options, and all these are building blocks, and we are team players, and therefore we need to get started there. This is also an opportunity to find your route out of the crisis: decarbonization, digitalization, decentralization, but also democratization. If you bear in mind these four components, then this will be in favor of the environment, of climate, and also of health. And this is my final slide today. I'm looking forward to the discussion with Harald and Mr. Vogel. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Kemfert, for this impressive presentation. It's going to certainly be interesting to discuss this afterwards. But first, let me introduce Harald Lesch. He is sitting right next to me. Well, most of you, well, we're not keeping social distance. Well, it's a dodgy, but I think we're really part of a household now because we meet each other so often. Harald is an astrophysicist and a philosopher, and he's a writer, he's a moderator, and he's a great communicator. He is also a comedian, and he's a climate activist, has been for a long time, and so he's ideally placed to talk about transdisciplinarity, because in his conferences he's having a dialogue with himself, and then you need a moderator in your mind also, basically. So I'm pleased to see you here, and I'm also glad that you have been supporting us for 18 months now in presentations or contributions or lectures. I'd like to start off with a question. What made you become committed to climate protection? Well, that was quite funny. In 1994, I qualified as a professor in Bonn with a public lecture about are we alone in the universe? So I looked back on Earth and asked, what makes this planet so habitable? And for the first time I was struck with the problem that Earth shouldn't really be able to carry life because its star, the sun, was much weaker in the early ages than it is now. So the Earth would be completely glaciarized. White, there would be an albedo effect, everything would be backscattered. Even if the sun had increased its power later, so there must have been some great effect, a much bigger climate or greenhouse effect than we know it now, which prevented from the Earth from becoming a glacier entirely. So it's a blue pearl: oceanography, meteorology, geology, physics, and everything. Everything was included in my thinking, and ever since I've been active in this field. And at the time it was a public lecture. There were 2,500 people listening. They didn't want to know about how Earth works. They wanted to know whether there is alien life or extraterrestrial life. But this alien idea was a kind of Trojan horse for me to bring the idea of the climate home to people without people noticing really. And then where we found we don't know how many planets there are in the universe, but this one planet has conditions which are ideal and which make it possible for humans to live there if the environment is properly acceptable. So planetary health is always an issue when you ask yourself whether there is life on this planet. When we met in November 2018, I told you about the first vigil we made in Berlin and showed you some pictures with Eckhard von Hirschhausen also. And it struck me that after 2 minutes, you noticed that the penny was dropping. Can you tell us something about that? Well, in your case, yeah, as Martin said, it also affects our health. The climate has to be seen differently. It's also ideally suited for communication. And these were all domino stones, and they fell over. It was so obvious you were right. So I was completely speechless, and I thought, this is the subject. And as we've heard the previous presentation, it's a cross-sectional subject. No matter which worldview you have and what you're doing, but your health, your personal health, the health of your loved ones, of your friends, plays a overwhelming role. And if the environment has such an effect on health, and if we are worsening the environmental conditions so much as we do now, then this has an effect on health, and it's a Trojan horse for me, which I can use and say, of course you can talk about climate and so on, and people will say, we've heard about that before, it's boring. But then as you talk about it's about your health, then people will really change. And we can see that the audience in a room will change very quickly. I'm always the warm-up act, by the way, to Martin, and then you stand there with your white coat as a doctor and say, well, ladies and gentlemen, these are going to be the consequences of climate change. It has a huge communicative effect, and this is what really makes me tick. Makes me think how you take scientific terms and break them down in such a way that you can communicate them. Claudia says democratization. This requires an informed society. People need to know what it's all about. It's not just some kind of buzzwords which they are bombarded with, but it's explained to them and they can be co-engaged. And then there is a question and answer game, and they will be able to realize what they can do personally, and it will be good not just for themselves but also their kids and their kids. And I'm teaching physics at the University of Munich and also philosophy and lots of environmental ethics. So the question is, how shall we treat the environment? That's part of the Institute for the interface between natural sciences and theology, and on ZDF I do the science broadcast. So it's all about creating the information, creating the scientific findings and reflecting about them. That is the position of the philosopher. Why do these sciences work as they do? Because thinking in terms of natural science is not something which comes natural to us. We need to learn to deal with abstract terms and putting this into a public context via a medium such as TV or internet, and presenting this and tell people about them. This concerns you personally, not just in any form, but directly. I've just made a video about the shock summer, which goes back to you, because you told me that we've got COVID pandemic now, but we may also get hot summer, and this will produce as many dead as we getting through COVID. Let me get back to the beginning. I didn't reflect on this, but this looking on the planet Earth from the outside, from a point of view of an astronomer, tells you that mankind is obliged to be in a home office on Earth. We're not going to get away from this planet. We have to make sure that our home, where we're living, this place should be a healthy place. And this is something which we obviously say as astronomers, because these distances to other planets are so large that even Elon Musk will not be able to cover these distances, and Mars is no alternative either. So we can only say it's all about planetary health. The planet has to be healthy, and then we'll be healthy. And looking at this from different perspectives, I think, is a very important thing. I told you that at the last presentation, Maike Weisplug talked about the philosophy of Hannah Arendt, and Louisa Neubauer also powerfully showed what political consciousness can mean. That's something we need to discuss constantly. One thing is the scientific finding and communicating that to each other and being infected and developing a bigger perspective, a more general perspective. But how do you translate this to informed citizens? Because science is limited. The action level is a question of the citizens to take over, really. Well, I think it was great, Claudia, what you told us about democratization and about the future. At the moment, there's a lot of things ending and very few things starting. We need to have a new beginning also, or start something new. And really, that's really what it's all about. In Vita Activa, Hannah Arendt, it says that philosophy is something which makes a beginning. Everyone is an initium, every day is a new beginning, and as with a new chapter in your book, you can start a fresh chapter every day. It is Vita Activa, it is not a classic philosophy. Philosophy is not the art of dying, philosophy is the art of living, and part of good life is health. And so this is so much entrenched in us that when we discuss this, we need to get back to this topic. And it's great if you discuss it. How should freedom be thought under the natural conditions? If you also think about these boundary conditions, freedom is not total freedom. Freedom is limited by natural laws. And this recognizing and respecting these boundaries, which we have known for decades, the fact that our planet is finite, resources are finite, and so on. And the great thing about renewable energies is, well, it's the fusion reactor, which is a nuclear fusion reactor, which is 150 million kilometers away from us and is supplying us with loads of energy. If we transform this energy, then many things are possible. These 4Ds Claudia mentions are exactly right. Let the sun shine in is exactly the main message. We should allow as much sunshine in as possible and transform this into energy. And regarding this as a positive task and not something uptight, well, we have to somehow manage. No, as Hannah Arendt always says in her writings, the opportunity which lies in the beginning. Don't always look back. What can we do now? And as you also say, Martin, what is a good doctor? What is the situation now? What options do we have? Working with these options and do the right thing first. And once you've done the right thing, you have to think about what the effect this has. Are we moving in the right direction? Did this have the right effect, or do we have to change tack? And we should not be frustrated from erring. I am also teaching science theory, and if I define physics, say physics is the science which has the method of erring. Physics is the conflict between experiment and theory. Theory comes up with a hypothesis, and then there is an experiment, and there is errors after errors after errors, and doubting about this is not a state of mind. Doubting is a method. You can work on becoming more and more precise, pinpointing the facts. And so if you are positively looking into the future, then it's okay to make errors and say, okay, we've tried this now, it's not the right one, let's try something else. And this confidence for the future will be a big task. And if you're alone, scientific contacts are not enough. So humor is certainly quite important. And humor is also what marks you. But this idea of permanent doubting, it's an important scientific method. But if we think about communicating between people, the permanent doubt about each other can be destructive because we need to build trust. It is important to see when are we talking about natural sciences and when do we return to the human dimension, because you only act in the human dimension, and the human dimension has different rules, and this principle of doubting would be very destructive in the human level. Yes, that's true. But on the other hand, in this dialogue, It can be a dialogue in a group or other kinds of dialogue situations. Something arises in us which is not measurable. What arises there is trust, credibility. What is the level of credibility with which you may present your data? Do you have to suppose that there's some kind of financial interest behind it? Or is the topic presented in such a way from all sides, objectively? And trust and credibility are the prerequisite for people working together. And trust is also investment. I trust you means you can go ahead, I'll let you do it, leave you to it. I give you the freedom to take certain action. So that's a conventional patient-doctor relationship. The patient should, of course, trust someone who treats him or her. And you can tell from that automatically that apart from this basis, this scientific findings, then there's the next level, which means that people start from what they know, but they transition to an action level and ask themselves what is to be done. But common sense tells you that future is open. Something new may happen in the future. There's a great phrase by Hannah Arendt, where people come together, you may expect some miracles. It's not natural miracles happening here. It's phenomena which no one expected in the room, or phenomena you've never heard about, which apparently exist as part of natural laws. But so far we thought these are impossible. Just imagine, I always think of the science fiction novel that Germany had opted for wind power in the 50s. So just think, the wind has been there before the wind power plants and windmills, and if we opted in the 50s for wind power as for nuclear, if we had invested as much money into nuclear power into wind power as we invested in wind power, imagine the technologies which would have now. So at the time it was the zeitgeist to have very densified, very concentrated energy sources. And then there was this narrative of the 20th century. That's something which is the holy grail. And if you've got that at home, then you have power plants. And everyone could have their own nuclear power, but in the garden even. And you can tell from that doing the right thing at the right time can be a decisive decision. So I think it's very interesting what you said, Claudia, about resilience. Resilience is, of course, the classic term. If I summarize my activities as a physicist, then I'm a specialist for complex systems. This has been my subject. Instabilities, nonlinear feedbacks, and we know this term is now summarized as resilience. How does a system behave if there are certain couplings? And you find clearly systems which have internal flexibilities are much more resilient to external stress than systems which are monothematic, dogmatic. These are systems which will really break, which under external pressure will really break, and also in an irreversible way. And what's interesting philosophically is that this kind of resilience is also what gives the potential for new things in nature. Nature is only nature if it is resilient to instabilities. It has to be adaptable, but for that it has to get rid of old things. Disruptive sometimes, you say, Claudia. Nature is maybe softer, but using the factor that a system has options, and which option will prevail, that's a question of the framework conditions, and we shouldn't underestimate that. What we find in nature, especially in physics, we have clear mathematical equations. Mostly these are differential equations. However, time is not an issue. As with experiments, in experiments you can always reset time to zero. But outside, in the world outside, you can't reset time. And Donna Leon once said, life is not a dress rehearsal. And so you have to deal with what happened before in time, and this also leads us to self-organization. What are the principles which create successful self-organization. And one answer is decentralization. Flexibility is crucial. The system has to be able to react to external stress, to communicate, to use new other degrees of freedom, and it should also be saving energy. And this is a point which really surprises me again and again. Of course, we trust technology a lot, it's all around us, but this discussion, I've also seen it from your slide just now, you put technologies in bold print, but energy saving you didn't put in bold print. But energy saving energy will be a crucial step to achieve these climate goals. And this means a question which, as to how to make society accept that, because increasing efficiency will not be enough. And these are the three things which really move my mind. There's always someone who tells me, can you use this subject for communication purposes? Can you use it philosophical or as a physicist? These three minds are in my mind, and they discuss with each other. I would like to just point out two orthodoxies which we have to focus on. One thing you mentioned yourself, which is technologies. That technologies are improving, getting bigger, everything is feasible and so on. That is the promise of modernity, and we can see it's a big risk if we believe that. And the second orthodoxy is to believe that we can control everything. And in this way, we are covering up the human dimension, being creative, dealing with complex things, always staying imperfect, using resilient systems. This is then covered up, and I think that's important to keep an eye on both of these things, because in the discussion now there is this promise that technologies will be able to solve the problems which we have, and that we can keep everything under control. And we've learned in the COVID crisis, and if we take climate crisis seriously, it's also true there that we don't have much control over much. And with this limited control, we need to be able to deal with this and regard it as a part and parcel of human action. Well, if we were in a courtroom now, I would say, objection, Your Honor, don't forget the defendant, mankind, had this experience for 400 years that everything would work out fine, starting with the celestial mechanics where the stars could be calculated. And then you had the idea that you can calculate everything, you can build machines, but for machines alone, you notice the difference between the cycle of a machine and the rhythm of a biological system. A rhythm can repeat periodically, but has some play, so there is some leeway. But in the machine, it has to be a cycle exactly, and if the cycle is missed, the whole machine breaks down. So we have a big success story of technology, of course. On the other hand, digitalization is invasive, and it invades all of our life spheres. And these little things we all use have simplified our life a lot. And we believe, and it's going to be a big challenge through artificial intelligence, that we can leave decisions to self-learning algorithms, and all the human traits, trust, generosity, credibility, these things are not open to an algorithm, and we are pushing that aside. And there's a huge potential of the sentence, when people come together, miracles may happen. We don't really accept this phrase anymore in many cases. Sometimes it happens and you may be completely surprised, and we may call that love or something, but we don't accept this as a big opportunity that when these challenges happen, climate crisis is too weak, a crisis will always go down at some point, but we really have to talk about a climate disaster. There is a meteorologist I'm working together with, and he says it's the first time Homo sapiens notices how climate is changing. As you say, Claudia, we are in the middle of this change, and we can see all kinds of changes, left, right, and center. In Norway, the coast is breaking off. In Siberia, the moors are burning. Spitsbergen's capital has to be evacuated because it's far too warm, far too hot. All these things. Or in Germany, If you go through the forest with a forester and he says the water table is going down, farmers have problems everywhere, left, right and center, but still, in the political sphere, people don't seem to realize there is a opportunity, which you could also tell from the COVID crisis. This opportunity is not being grasped the way we should grasp it. And that makes us think about what politics is able to do, what society is able to do, being disciplined. And maybe here I agree with you, Claudia, we can learn a lot from Corona. And all we need to do now is keep going. Planetary health, or the health issue, is the issue where it is going to be, we're going to be most successful to also motivate the man in the street, the woman in the street. Thank you very much. We're going to keep talking, but first of all, we'll bring in Johannes Vogel. You've also got your microphone on. I would like to introduce you. You are the Director General of the Museum for Natural History, and he's read biology in Cambridge and other places. He went to the Natural History Museum in London. He is also chair of the Leibniz Institute for Bioresearch and professor for biodiversity at the Humboldt University. He advises the EU Commission and the federal government. He is chair of the European Association of Citizens Science. It's very nice to have you with us. I'm also glad to be with you. We've known each other for maybe half a year now, more closely, and I know that in your museum, Planetary Health has been a key term for your work for about 1 year. Can you tell us why and how does it relate to you personally? Well, we've heard two great presentations now, which really outline the problems we're dealing with very nicely. We're living in a world which simply cannot continue like this. At the same time, we all feel quite good, mostly in this world. Germany is the focus of wealth and happiness, really. And I'm really impressed that there are 1,200 young people listening to us now, because the training possibilities are ideal. Probably are unique in Germany, education and training, and it's great that you always try to further train and educate yourselves and make a difference in the course of your future life. And then we have a museum I'm chairing, and the objects we have are 4.5 billion years old, maybe. Objects which tell us something about the origin of our solar system, and there may be some objects there which may be also important when it comes to asking the question who we are. And you take a look at this museum, a child of enlightenment, which has been set up to document the way man has controlled nature, including the colonial history and other aspects. And you can see on one hand nature is being celebrated, but at the same time there is a whole lot of hubris with which we are dealing nature. And you ask yourselves why people don't understand this. I've been reflecting on this a lot, and many things which have been mentioned actually are exactly along those lines. There are a few things which worry me. One thing which concerns me is the fact that I want to maintain democracy and I want to maintain nature. At the same time, what you can see increasingly in recent years is that the new apocalyptic horsemen are inequality and destruction of nature. And these two horsemen have joined forces. And the first thing these two horsemen want to do is destroying democracy, because this is most likely to be the only thing which can stand in the way of this destruction, a democratic society based on knowledge. And now, looking at this, the question is, how do we create a democratic society based on knowledge? And as Harald correctly says, it's important for us to become a knowledge-based democracy. And at the same time, there must be a more democratic kind of science. It's not just a one-way street. We need to also appeal to the 500,000 scientists in Germany to make sure they will do justice to their responsibility, also in terms of the training which they have been subsidized with and supported with by the state. So how can you make reconcile science and democracy with each other? And how can we achieve change? I've always believed that nature is really the key to this. There is this a bit stupid saying, David Attenborough, who is the leading natural scientist, natural historian in the UK, and he was asked by a journalist, Sir David, when did you discover your love of nature? And, well, David Attenborough laughs and says, when did you lose your love of nature? Well, we people are born to observe nature. A few 100,000 years ago, or even 200 years ago, without observing nature, we wouldn't have been able to survive for 3 or 4 days. And so nature is a possibility to create an emotional link, and it's only once we have an emotional relationship that we achieve a rational discourse. And so I thought nature is first and foremost. That's nice because I'm also director of a natural history museum. But if you think about it even more deeply, and think about the concept of planetary health, this is even smarter than observing nature, because it comes closer to humans and to the interest of humans. And if it's only if we really appeal to people's human interest that we'll make progress. The challenges are rising. The current racial unrest in the US, for example, they also relate to climate change, because it's exactly people of color who are very committed to climate protection, because they are hardest hit, because they live in the inner cities, and also they suffer from a poor health system, and they are very much hit by the changes. And then COVID comes on top of all this. So the links which have a direct impact on politics are becoming clearer and clearer in the Western world, and we need to find some lever to talk to people, to also talk to politicians. And as we've just heard, politicians, as a principle, seem to overestimate society's knowledge, but underestimates people's willingness to become engaged. And this is where we have to make a change. And this is where I see that the science system is insufficient, is inadequate. If you take a look at the map of Germany and look at where science is being done in Germany, it would be nationwide. There are lots of universities, extra university institutes everywhere. So if you draw a circle around it, 99% of the German population would be captured. Why don't they go out to the people? Why don't they go out and try and establish an understanding of science, the procedural knowledge of science, and also learn what is interesting to people, because that can also go both ways. Maybe less so for astrophysicists, but for biologists, engineers, dietitians, or economists, these are real-life problems, and you can work on them. Why don't we talk to them? And these are things which make me concerned. And using health as a missing link, planetary health and healthy society for a healthy planet, that's a smarter way of saying I'm a natural history museum, and that's why I think that's exciting. Oh, great. Now you just said that you've got lots of transdisciplinarity in your science, but you also think about how to reach out to people, how to reach out to politicians. You are trying to set up new kinds of dialogues in your history museum. Maybe you can tell us something about your lab knowledge and also tell us what the interest level is on the part of politicians and the population at large. Well, in Germany, what happens now is people are coming closer to the idea of let's have an experiment and not just continue as before, which is good. And if you look at how dialogue is done between science and society, then scientists are people in white coats who are in charge. That is, of course, an important component, and you can use humor for that, which would be a different approach because Harald is doing that successfully. But I think scientists have to learn how to listen. That costs more energy and costs more time, and in order to practice that, you need spaces. And you can only change yourselves before you can make others change. We did this in our own museum. So we created a room in our museum in which you can directly engage in a dialogue by making us listen, making us face up to a discussion, which was the most important development in the museum in the last few years. The fact that now we have become a museum for young adults. So previously 50% of our visitors were young adults between 16 and 40 before Corona, because we have tried to establish dialogue between science and the population at large. And if you have such a demography, and I wouldn't know of any other museum which is comes close to us, and we have 100,000 visitors per year, which is not nothing, and also we're in the capital. And therefore, politicians are waking up, and they are attracted to you, because this is exactly the group of people who are very interesting to politicians, and also a group of people who are listening and watching here, if I understand this series correctly, because the future needs to be shaped, and this must be done by this generation listening to us now. And I think my task is to pave the way for that, to allow for experiments, to allow for errors, and others can then learn from them. Johannes, you are inviting us to move into an office in your museum because you want to have us close to you, with the invitation of also becoming engaged in this experimentation. What I'm interested in is a comment on that, why you think our work is so important, and also what are the topics you are advising the EU and the federal government on. So what are the sort of questions they approach you with? Well, as Ms. Kemfert, I'm a member of certain bodies. It's not myself alone. It's done in teams. And for the EU, I've been working in a commission or a committee which has looked at the change and opening of the science system as a whole. So how do you create an open knowledge system in Europe? That was for the EU, that was very good, and some very smart ideas came out of that, which have been subscribed to by the member states. Now at the national level we have to make sure these are implemented, so there will be some systemic change of the scientific system as to how we rate scientists, for example. So that is not just excellence, but also relevance, which are going to be counted as well. So it's a new remix of excellence and relevance. And for the federal government, I'm part of the so-called high-tech forum, and the question there is how to create an innovation system which integrates both social and technical innovation rather. These are things which have been mentioned in this series before. So what I'm really keenly interested in, Mr. Lesch is trained for that. I'm an amateur, but how can you think in terms of systems? How can you influence systems? These are things which are interesting for me, and I'm really focusing on the scientific system because I think it's far too hierarchical, obsolete. It's inimical to errors and is simply too lethargic. So Germany could be doing more for the world if it became more dynamic, more saying yes to errors, to making mistakes, and also to being close to citizens. Thank you very much, Johannes. I would like to open the discussion between us. Who would like to start? Ms. Kemfert, thank you very much for these great inputs. That's great. Especially, Harald, what you said, I thought was very relevant. The idea of resilience, or the idea of health and the opportunities we have connected to that, and also the path dependencies. And I would like to dwell a few minutes on that because I thought it's interesting what you said, that if in the 1950s we would have built windmills instead of nuclear, and I come from the north of Germany, there are windmills there which are 200 years old. So windmills, that's an old technology, but if we had started in the 50s to go more for renewables, then we would have a different world today. Unfortunately, these old concepts are taking out of the drawers again. There are some scientists, renowned ones, who are starting to talk about nuclear again quite seriously. And they seriously claim that nuclear is the answer to the climate crisis, but the waste which is generated there is completely being ignored. So I'm with Johannes Vogel. Scientists have to be critical about themselves as to what is possible and what isn't, and saving energy, investing in renewable energies, that's completely true. Those are the two TOS issues we are talking about, and the flexibility and resilience a system can have. And here we talk about the role of science. I thought this was interesting, Johannes Vogel. I like going to natural history museums, not just because of these dialogues in the dinosaur room. I would like to recommend the Natural History Museum to everyone. There are some great exhibits there of which you can learn a lot about history, about flexibility, and how a system can actually work. And this may be also an interesting thought, that on the one hand we should mobilize society. We have a responsibility with our knowledge to make it clear what the risks are and what the opportunities are if we embark upon certain paths, looking back and looking in the future. But at the same time, we have to make it very clear that sometimes people are barking up the wrong tree. For example, establishing nuclear in their gardens. That's something which is really put forward by a few scientists now. And here we have to show up a few paths forward and ways forward as to how a system can become flexible for the future, which would then also ensure planetary health. But the planet also means humans, as long as we still live on the planet. Of course, we are bound to remain in the home office of the planet. I think that's a great image, and we can't just go to outer space. And this is also an opportunity for us to make ourselves comfortable in this home office. There are a lot of learning effects as to how we can coexist with nature as a society and how we can correct each other. Now we've got some highly decorated scientists in this discussion round, so I would like to reflect on what our role could be when it comes to pointing out certain erroneous paths and correct paths and solutions for society at large, which is looking for a solution. And they certainly regard us having a lot of responsibility. I think that's an exciting question. Well, Something which makes me concerned is how we can create coalitions or start to make initiatives which establish a broader understanding for the process of sciences. So the idea of hypothesis, error, risk, these are things which we may be familiar with as scientists, but out there, these things are not being understood. And COVID, I think, is a great and interesting nexus, something which makes us think about it. If you look at the Bild Zeitung reporting about Drosten, how words are being changed by the news media and how facts are created, they could not do that. They could not have this skewed kind of coverage if people reading the Bild Zeitung knew how science works. And why do scientists not work for creating a better understanding for what they are doing in society? We are happy with the fact that we're being subsidized by society, but we cannot really explain ourselves. We haven't really understood this is also one of our tasks. This is a basic question for us, for me. And health, as shown by COVID now, health is one of the smartest approaches to establish this kind of broad-based education, popular education. Well, I wouldn't have thought I would have to defend the scientific institutions in Germany, but both the Max Planck Society and all universities have improved their PR work, especially when it comes to citizens' science. So much more is being done now. More and more of these projects exist. For example, currently there is a project promoted by VW Foundation where it's about the fact that universities go out and ask the population what they want us to do. And especially the link between universities and schools is improving, so teachers' networks and so on. There is a lot of things. I can say this because my wife is very active in this respect. So you are quite right, Johannes. It would be great if directors of big research institutions were to regularly go out there and talk to people, so to tell them what they are doing, not just talk about themselves, but also understand what's going on out there in the field. And I think in Munich we could say there are some greenhouses, basically, where the gentlemen and ladies from the scientific community talk to each other, but they will not be there when it comes to really going out and destroying conspiracy theories, contributing to the clarification of facts, to be very objective. And my big hope is that amongst the students now, there are lots of people who are interested in exactly this kind of discussion. That's interesting. And it's going to continue for a while until they notice as postdocs they have to publish something. And then there is this pressure they have to publish. And the science factories which exist there, these make it very hard for people, until people have a permanent job, make it impossible for them to be engaged in this discussion. So this economization of the science factory, you have to keep writing applications, writing bids. Will I have money for the next few years? This is pressurizing scientists. But it would be nice if society said, you are so important, we give you what you need, but then we expect you also to, in return, give us something back, making us be part of the scientific processes. We can see it not just in Bild Zeitung, in the tabloids, but society has really accompanied virologists in the last 2 or 3 months, and all of a sudden people know what a peer review is, what a preprint is, and so on. All these things which we are dealing with every day in scientific work, this is now being noticed by people. Has there been the peer review? Well, there's been no peer review, so we shouldn't think about that. I think that's interesting to hear this from people who have not involved with science. So there are interesting scientists, And you can't be an escapist. You can't just withdraw to your lab or somewhere and keep the world out there. And then there is a part of your science which is relevant, and that must be clear. Astronomy is highly interesting. That's why I'm frequently invited to parties and to make presentations in the evening presentations. It's nothing to do with, it's not relevant. But if someone who is a bit sneaky as myself and introduces greenhouse gas in these presentations, people are frustrated because they expect me to be an astronomer and just talk about the stars. But there are Trojan horses available everywhere, and not explain to people what it is, but really provocative and really asking people what they want to know from us. Because we need to listen to people out there as well. It's a kind of dialogue at eye level. Talking to people at eye level, that would be great. I'd be very pleased if we had more and more colleagues who did this. I agree. I think science has really progressed much more. I'm working at the German Institute for Economic Research, and even under our statutes, we're obliged to share all our findings with the population at large. That's our job. And I think it's really important for us. More institutions, more universities need to go out to the science communication. But for that to happen, you need some willingness on the part of the population out there to be open. And I think we can learn from the pandemic. People are starting to understand how science works, what does peer review really mean, and so on. People are beginning to understand that now. And then it's possible to communicate findings, and it's an essential point we need to realize. And ever since there's been fake news, scientists are called upon more than ever to stand up against these crude statements. So thankfully we have Science for Future, more scientists who speak up in public, and they really contribute to education. When it comes to the bonuses for cars or subsidies for cars, for the first time we've seen scientists who are speaking up, saying clearly that bonuses paid for combustion engine cars is just no good. And for the first time we have a scientific finding and a broad public against them, was realized by politicians, so they couldn't go ahead with these subsidies for combustion engine cars. So Johannes Vogel is right, we need to have the broad public in order to make things moving in the right direction. Lisa, maybe you can give us a few questions. I would like to also talk about one question, because we're talking about active action, and you've got some instructions for action in your book. Maybe you can pick out one or two of these examples, something which you don't typically hear. Well, my book is called Mondays for Future, and what I do is educate. That's one of the tasks we just mentioned. I'm answering 123 questions. I'm being asked by the audiences, because I'm traveling a lot and people ask me these questions. I give them answers there. I also want to encourage people to address things. So it's over and above a recommendation for consumption. It's about strengthening democracy. It's about a generational contract, increasing democracy. And one important point at this point is to become engaged, no matter at what point, whether it's the company where you can become active or in the club, in your family. You can become active there, and every little helps. So if everyone takes action, we can see that we can have a huge effect. So getting away from resignation, from throwing in the towel, to moving towards innovative action, I think that's really important. And there are many examples about renewable energies in my book. There are many developments mentioned there which need to be looked at. I have looked at these questions briefly just now, and the idea was planet for humans. The question being, what does it mean if I expand renewable energies? Will there be conflicts with other sustainability goals? I'm talking about this book quite well. The sustainability goals which we need to bear in mind: equal opportunities, health, equality between men and women, equal education, equal access to water and energy. So I think it's important to understand where we come from, what our subjects are, and why it is so important for us to contribute, and why it is so important to become active. And so I'd like to appeal to everyone. Therefore, I'm very glad to be part of this discussion, because it's one building block as to how we can start becoming active. Okay, Lisa. Well, we have a few questions, especially to you, Ms. Kemfert. How does the German Institute for Economic Research relate to the new stimulus program by the German government, the promotion of the automotive industry and establishing Germany as a hydrogen country #1? What would have been your ideal stimulus package? Well, I mentioned the scrapping scheme for thankfully, it hasn't been introduced for diesel and petrol engine cars, thanks to the broad criticism which has been mentioned. Buying bonuses for electrical cars, while raising those, I don't think it's very useful, as long as there are destructive subsidies such as low diesel taxes and so on. I would have wished for more courage in favor of climate protection and health protection, and at least this can be seen partially. So I'm more optimistic now than I was 10 years ago when we had the financial crisis, producing a stimulus package with scrapping schemes which were completely destructive. Negative. So if you had to give us school marks, it would be a C or even a B. And in the last stimulus package, I would have said an F, really. But now people have really started to move into the good direction in terms of climate protection. The hydrogen strategy, Harald Lesch can tell us more about that. We've been talking about the hydrogen society for 40 years. The reason is that we used to have nuclear power, and for hydrogen you need more energy to produce that. I'm really in favor, like Harald, of really drastic energy saving measures and the use of hydrogen in to a small extent. Producing hydrogen is a complete waste, is a huge wastage, and if you do so, this should only be done for where there are no alternatives. From my point of view, it could be heavy industry, and also in very small measure for heavy goods vehicles which need different fuels. But tanking SUVs, powerful engines with hydrogen, I think that is very critical indeed. And I would rather be in favor of reducing or limiting this to the areas where hydrogen is really useful. So I don't think Germany is a hydrogen industry #1. Of course, it is a possibility to store energy in the shape of hydrogen, but it should be very moderate and modest. Thank you very much. There is one further specific question to you, which is also about the stimulus package by the government. Most countries, including Germany, have adopted the Kyoto Protocol, but only few countries actually make these goals. So would we need an international instrument to force countries to pursue their goals more strictly? And if so, what kind of instrument could that be? Well, the Paris Agreement has been ratified, so you can't really escape that. You can't really say, let's adopt it, but not do anything. Then you have to be consistent like Trump, leaving it. But once you ratify it, you have to implement it. There is no two ways about it. So we really have to measure the federal government by their action, and what they are doing now should be not in contradiction with climate protection, and a new coal-fired power plant is not part of this. And the Coal Commission also recommended not to put data into the grid. We don't need that power plant, especially not to reach our climate goals. It is negative, and then would also be obliging ourselves to produce coal-fired electricity for decades, and we need to criticize that very strongly, which we do. So there is a certain degree of pressure also on other countries, and there are lots of countries who do a few things. I would be more optimistic. You don't have to be too critical about this. Asking them to pay more penalties. I think it's a very, very good agreement, and once you've ratified it, you can't really escape it, except if you withdraw from the agreement completely. And then, once you do, you have to really implement it. So, thank you very much for your presentation. And I think we'll have to close now. I think it was great to have the opportunity to discuss here. Also great to see Johannes Vogel again, currently only virtually, but normally we meet really in reality, and also Harald Lesch and everyone else who is here. It was a great format. I've been very pleased to be with you today, although I have to go now, unfortunately. But I would like to wish you a good further discussion, and hopefully we've been able to give you some bright ideas, food for thought for climate protection and health. And let me also say best wishes from the expert commission on health, because climate protection is there upmost on the agenda. Thank you very much. Wish you all the best, and I quite agree when it comes to hydrogen. Well, that's very nice. Thank you very much indeed. So see you next time, Harald. So what really gives me worries is the term science communication. I know that VW is promoting this term. I think it is a very dangerous term because it seduces us to continue as before. And the comparison I would like to make there is with American television. In American television, in recent years, the weather reports have been increased to the max. So you can watch the weather for 24 hours, but you're not going to hear one word about climate. The same in German universities. Science communication has been increased to the max. There are huge PR departments communicating all kinds of things, sending all kinds of messages. But this prevents scientists from going out to the field and talking to people direct. And this is what I call dialogue. And science communication is not doing justice to the term used. And the health system is quite interesting. Doctors are engaging in dialogue. They don't engage in monologue. And that's the way forward. That's how you can create trust. So ensure that patients will listen to you. And the challenge for the science system, I see that Germany is moving, but 20% of the funding is taken out and really used to train people in doing a dialogue, embarking on different career paths, creating more ability to create dialogue and so on. I think it's great what the VW Foundation is doing, and Munich and Berlin also. That's all very important and great, but we need to be systemic about it. We have to look at ourselves, ask ourselves, what are we doing? It's important to have VW as a catalyst, but redirecting funding is important. What kind of leadership do we need to have in science in the next few decades? We need to do it, and it's still a lot of things to be desired. I think we should really set the bar much higher in terms of science communication. That will be my point of view. And it's great what Harald Lesch is doing with his communication. I'm sure you are reaching hundreds of thousands of people. But why don't we have 500 copies of Harald Lesch? Or 500,000 copies of Harald Lesch? How do we achieve this situation? How can we get 50,000 copies of Harald Lesch? That is, of course, a horrible view or idea. But Mr. Vogel, you're quite right. I always complain about this because I sometimes feel like an exotic animal if I in this group of people. Oh, this is Mr. Lesch from television, okay. But I try to get as many people as possible to engage in the dialogue and listen to people. What do people actually want? What makes people tick who believe that the earth is flat? I think we should have a glass of beer together and find out what's going on there. This sort of beer pub situation is important. I would like to ask a final question maybe, because we are sometimes only at the beginning of our careers, and we hear that communication is important, interdisciplinarity is important, and so on. But what is your advice to budding scientists, budding doctors or carers, whoever may be listening, to change this? What is the right step forward, what you're doing? You are being bombarded from all kinds of sides, and you can form yourselves an opinion. What Martin Herrmann and his team and you have created, those are the beginnings of connecting things which used to be thought separately. We need to have more of those people. That's one of the advantages of these terrible devices which give you a stiff neck. Well, my students, for example, started to create a format of making presentations in a stable, basically, and they stream things into YouTube and so on. And this way, you can learn whether you can actually survive being on a stage, or will I really have red spots on my face. And they really do very nicely. It's very good for them, because I can only recommend to you, please tell a larger quantity of people who are not related to your discipline, with the enthusiasm you have, tell them about why you're doing it. And then in their faces you will see the fascination for your own discipline, and that is a moment which is rare amongst colleagues. It's a moment where I think, oh yes, they are listening to me, and it's great, and I can tell more stories, and you get questions back, and this is creating interest. Of course, it's very hard to get started, and for many people it's difficult to stand in front of others and to talk about their science. That's a barrier to cross, but I think it pays, because then you learn your own science, get to know your science much better. And it's just make a presentation about what you're doing, what your science is. This really has enriched my profession and has led me on to ending up with the media, because a colleague of mine told me, I don't want to be embarrassed in front of the camera. You go and ask Mr. Lesch, because he did something. Otherwise, I wouldn't have ended up with a TV station. So an astrophysicist said, no, I'm afraid to appear in television. That led me to have the chance of getting this opportunity, because a new television station was created, and they asked me, are you going to talk about astronomy? And then I started talking about astronomy in television. It's a great opportunity. And what's always interesting is to go to the Open University and ask them whether they are interested. Young people have to do it. They have to be able to talk about what they are doing in such a way that others don't just feel it's interesting, but really ask questions about it. In this way, we can really establish dialogue between science and the world out there. So talk to people who are not normally dealing with scientists, and I can only hope there will be more people who like doing so. It's a kind of exhibitionism. You have to like being on stage, and you shouldn't really despair in front of talking in front of people. You can always learn this. This is something you can learn. I can only recommend you should go to an open university course and go on the theatre course, and the first role you're going to get is being a mass murderer. That helps a lot. That's biographically. Without the mass murderer part, he wouldn't have been here. So that's a nice way of closing this. Just a brief summary with quotes from all three speakers today. Claudia Kemfert says, you have to contribute something. Johannes says, create your own experimental field. And Harald says, well, just you go ahead and dare do something. I think this is a great message for the next few days and the weekend. Just start discussing with other people, and maybe on Monday you can get your hands dirty, as Claudia Kemfert says. And also, picking up from Mr. Vogel, next time will be about communication. So if you're interested how to learn to communicate better, just join us again, please, next time, because we're looking forward to you. Stay tuned. Enjoy the evening.